DPP also won a comfortable majority in the legislature. So she, unlike the only other DPP president, Chen Shui-bian, ever to hold the presidency, will enjoy a majority of her own party in the legislature. So this is a historic turning point, or a historic moment, at least, for Taiwanese politics. This has never happened before. And so what I'm going to do in the 25 minutes I have is talk a little bit about what was at stake in this election, and then I'm going to talk specifically about the presidential election, and then move on to the legislative election, because there were separate campaigns and there were some separate issues in these as well. So first off, what was at stake in this election on January 16, 2016? The first is the presidency was actually an open seat election. The current incumbent, Ma Ying-jeou, has now served 2 terms in office. He's term limited out. And so the KMT had to find a new nominee. The DPP nominated their chairwoman. The KMT actually had a little trouble settling on a nominee, as I'll talk about more in a second. The legislature, until this point, has always been controlled either by the KMT itself or by a coalition of KMT and kind of breakaway KMT-like parties, which I'll call the Pan-Blue camp together. In addition, the current incumbent, President Ma Ying-jeou, and his own party, according to public opinion polls, were actually quite unpopular over the last 4 years. In fact, Ma Ying-jeou, I'll show this data later, but Ma Ying-jeou's public approval ratings were at or below 20% for most of his second term. To put that in some American perspective, Richard Nixon, if I remember right, had an approval rating of 24% when he resigned from office. So Ma Ying-jeou was below Richard Nixon at resignation approval levels for most of his second term. And so that just acts as a drag on his own party when they're trying to campaign in this election. In addition, there was a big event in March 2014 where a bunch of student-led protesters actually suddenly rushed into the legislature and occupied the legislature, preventing it from doing any business for 3 weeks. And that was ostensibly to block the passage of a free trade agreement with China. And that actually succeeded in blocking the agreement, and kind of served as a jumping off point for a lot of these activists to get involved in electoral politics as well. And so later that year, in December 2014, there was a local election and the KMT got trounced. And this was really kind of a sea change in Taiwanese politics. The DPP really benefited from the KMT's unpopularity. The headline race was the mayor of Taipei, where a DPP-leaning incumbent, or DPP-leaning independent, actually handily defeated the KMT's own nominee. And Taipei had traditionally been seen as this bastion of KMT support. So this was a real swing away from traditional patterns of competition. And so the key questions then going into this campaign, they had a little over a year between that local election and this national election. Number one, would the KMT actually be able to recover some of the support that it had lost in 2014? Or, conversely, would the DPP be able to continue to capitalize on the unhappiness with Ma Ying-jeou and the KMT and turn that into votes for national office as well as local office? And then third, there's a multiplication of activists and kind of proto-parties floating around in the Taiwanese political scene over the last year. And the big question in this election for them was whether they could actually convert a lot of this protest activity into actual votes and seats in the legislature. And there's one party in particular that was founded just about a year ago today, close to today actually, the New Power Party, which featured several prominent leaders of the Occupy legislature movement, and actually ran some very high-profile candidates from the island. And so the question was whether they would actually succeed in making it into the legislature. Okay. So let me talk a bit about the presidential campaign, and then I'll come back to the legislature. In the presidential campaign, we had 3 candidates. Tsai Ing-wen, I've already mentioned. the chairwoman of the Democratic Progressive Party. She was actually the nominee in 2012 as well, lost to Ma Ying-jeou in a fairly close race. Because of the DPP's success in 2014, when she was chairwoman, she had a clear path to the nomination, and there wasn't a large amount of contestation or a challenge to her. On the other side, there was a surprise nominee. There were a series of high-profile KMT candidates who declined, for whatever reason, to run for president starting about a year ago. And they ended up with the vice speaker of the legislature. Her name is Hong Xiu-ju. And she was a surprise, kind of a dark horse candidate. And then when she began to campaign, her rhetoric and her image actually kind of dragged the party's numbers down even worse than they were before. And so she turned out to be not a particularly effective candidate to have at the top of the party list. And one of the damaging things for the KMT from this was they got another emergence of a kind of perennial third-party candidate, James Soong, who in this election was running in his 4th presidential campaign. So he came out, declared that he was going to run and try to soak up a bunch of votes that would go to the KMT. So we had a 3-way race. And eventually, her numbers proved so unpopular, so poor, that the party eventually nominated the chairman of the party, who everybody thought was going to run all along. And I think there's an interesting story waiting to be written about why he didn't run in the first place. But he ended up...
I didn't want to lose.
Yeah, well... he ended up losing anyway, and he ended up at the top of the ticket late in the game. There was a kind of 11th hour switch, and so then he had to face off against Tsai, but also Soong. This 11th hour switch is kind of symbolic of the dysfunction within the KMT that's been prevalent over the last couple of years. For one, I've mentioned already, President Ma was very unpopular. Here's the actual data, and I apologize for not showing this in English. This is the start of Ma's 2nd term. The blue line is the disapproval rating for Ma, so it's at 70% or above for almost his entire 2nd term. And here's the approval rating down here, the dark blue line. And so he's at or below 20% for virtually his entire 2nd term. In addition to that, his own personal unpopularity, he got into a public battle with the Speaker of the Legislature, who's also a member of his own party, Wang Jinping. He attempted to have Wang kicked out of the KMT and stripped of his party post, and therefore stripped of his control of the legislative speaker's position. That case got tangled up in the courts, and Wang ultimately survived in his position. But that battle was very public and very ugly, and it ended up leading to a kind of prolonged split within the party as well. Third, the Sunflower Movement in March 2014. Unfortunately for Ma, Wang Jinping was actually in a position to protect the students as Speaker of the Legislature, and did so for much of their time in the legislature. And so there was continued kind of disagreement about how to respond to this within the party structure. And then finally, the trouble with the nominee. Hong eventually is replaced by Ju. This angers a lot of people who had supported Hong in the party. And then again, you have the problem of James Soong kind of popping up and trying to soak up some of the pan-blue vote. And so, on top of all of this KMT dysfunction, there was a rather sudden downturn in the economy over the 3rd and 4th quarters of 2015. And this is closely linked to a downturn in the Chinese economy. One of President Ma's major priorities was trying to increase contacts with Taiwan and mainland China. And as a consequence, actually, Taiwan's trade with mainland China had increased quite a bit over this period. And so that made Taiwan actually more vulnerable to a downturn a bit ironically. And so the combination of KMT dysfunction and an economic downturn means that this presidential election was pretty much preordained. It was very clear from months before Tsai appeared. She's got a 20-point lead on any of her opponents. And the big question was whether Eric Ju would actually be able to recover a bunch of the voters who were fleeing to James Soong. And he didn't. So let me show you the final vote here. Here's 2012. KMT wins about 51% of the vote. 2016, they're down to 31%. DPP has increased its vote share up to 56%, and the PFP, James Soong, is at 12.84%. So one thing to note about this, Tsai Ing-wen in some forecasts was being predicted to win as much as 60% of the vote. So she actually, in the end, kind of underperformed some expectations about how much she would win. And part of that may have to do with turnout, which was very low in this election. I'll talk a bit more about that later. Kind of takeaways from the presidential election. I really think this result was much more about the KMT and Ma Ying-jeou than about the KMT. For one, Ma's cross-strait policies were increasingly unpopular among the electorate at large. There's a lack of progress in many domestic areas, including Taiwan has a fairly small tax base given the size of its economy. Rising inequality in Taiwan became a very salient political issue over this period. Youth unemployment is rather high by historic standards, and so on and so forth. There wasn't a whole lot of concrete efforts by the government under Ma to address these over the last few years. And so Tsai was actually in a pretty good position. She just had to be not Ma Ying-jeou in this election, and she was. She was clearly different from him. But I do think, rather than saying this was kind of a one-off election where everything that could go wrong did go wrong for the KMT, I do think there are some pretty ominous signs for the KMT's long-term success as an electoral force in Taiwan. And the biggest is the KMT lost, or at least according to polls before the election, was going to lose the youth vote by something like 5 to 1. All right. These are the voters who are going to be in the electorate for decades into the future. If you're losing that group of voters 5 to 1, you are in a terrible long-term position. Demographics are going to take over, and your own base is going to shrink very quickly. And in addition, now that we know who's won and lost in the legislature and the presidential race and around the island in local races, there are no real clear young leaders to take over the party. In fact, the fight over the party chairmanship right now is among a bunch of people from the old guard. There's not a clear kind of and the DPP had Tsai Ing-wen kind of emerge out of a similar situation in 2008. There's not a clear kind of KMT version of Tsai Ing-wen who's going to ride to the rescue and save the party, at least that I've seen so far. To give you an idea of how these trends have shifted over time, this is kind of the DPP's nadir in 2008. Very blue in the north and the center of Taiwan. Gets a little greener in 2012, and then in 2016, one thing that was particularly shocking to me was Tsai Ing-wen actually won a majority in Taipei City. Taipei City, again, has its reputation as being this very blue bastion of KMT support. She won a majority there. And so that's kind of a sea change in Taiwanese politics as well. All right. So that's the presidential campaign. Now let me talk about the legislative campaign, where there was a lot more uncertainty about what was going to happen in the election. The basics, Taiwan has 3 parts to its electoral system for the legislature. The first and largest is 73 single-member districts. They're just like U.S. House seats, plurality rule, winner take all. There are 6 reserved aborigine seats that are elected in 2 national districts, 3 seats each, using a single non-transferable vote. And then the second largest component is 34 closed list party seats. These are chosen through a separate ballot, and a party has to win at least 5% of the party vote on that ballot to get seats in the legislature. And so there's a very different dynamic in campaigning for all three of these tiers.